Everyone, it's time for another college football video, this time with a fancy microphone. All right, let's get that out of the way so I can have a little bit better sound quality for these videos. In this video, I want to talk about the conference schedules for the upcoming 2020 season because a lot of news has come out in the last week to 10 days from the ACC, from the Pac-12, and from the SEC about how they are going to handle the schedule for the 2020 college football season. I've got a number of articles that I'm linking to in the information section, so if you want to use those if you want to read those articles yourselves, you can go ahead and find them there. The first is an article from Heather Dinich, who is the head sports writer for college football for ESPN, talking about the SEC and what they've decided to do for this upcoming year. They've decided to play a 10-game conference-only schedule. That's going to begin September 26th, so almost a month later than the regular college football season is going to start. Week 0 of college football was supposed to start on August 29th, and the SEC is now not going to start until September 26th, almost a month later. The SEC title game is going to get pushed back 2 weeks to December 19th. The SEC in a normal football year will play 8 conference games. They play 6 games against in-division opponents. So, for example, LSU, the defending national champs, is in the SEC West. They will play 6 games against SEC West opponents every year. They'll also play 1 inter-conference game against a permanent rival, meaning one team from the SEC East is a team that LSU will play every single year. And then the last of their normal conference games will be against a rotating opponent interconference, meaning they'll play another team from the SEC East, but they'll rotate which team that is every single year. And they're going to stick with that schedule, that same basic schedule. They're just going to add more, I believe, interconference games onto it, interdivisional games onto it. So they're going to play a few other schools from the other division within their conference. So instead of just playing 2 games against SEC East schools, I believe LSU will be playing 4 games against SEC East schools, and same thing for all the other teams in the conference. Annual cross-conference rivalry games that involved SEC versus ACC matchups against teams that are in their state, their in-state rivalry games. Florida State, Georgia Tech, South Carolina Clemson, and Kentucky Louisville have been canceled. They've been shut down. They're not going to end up playing those games because they don't want to leave their conference, which from what I was able to read and what from the Heather Dinich article says, those 4 schools in the SEC lobbied hard to get those games still on the schedule for this year. They want those in-state rivalry games. They wanted to play those rivalry games. They thought they're in-state. So what's the difference between Florida going to Tallahassee from Gainesville or Florida State going from Tallahassee to Gainesville and Florida going to Athens to play Georgia or to Jacksonville to play Georgia in a neutral site game? What's the difference? Well, the SEC leadership decided, nope, we're not going to do that. South Carolina coach Will Muschamp said, hey, I didn't make that decision. That was a league decision. That was a conference decision, which if you read it between the lines, you get the sense that he's not very happy with the decision the SEC made. Neither is the ACC for that matter, and I'll get to that momentarily. But finishing up with the SEC, other cross-conference matchups like Tennessee-Oklahoma and LSU-Texas have also been canceled for this year, so we will not get to see a repeat of the LSU-Texas matchup. That was an absolute stellar game last year. That's not happening in 2020. And also, schools like Louisiana Monroe, who was supposed to play 2 SEC schools, Arkansas and Georgia, those games have gotten canceled as well because Louisiana Monroe is not an SEC school. Louisiana Monroe is going to lose $3.2 million that they were supposed to get from those 2 games when they have a $15.5 million sports budget. So 1/5 of their budget was going to get paid for by playing those two games, and now that's getting wiped off, which shows you that this conference schedule thing that many of the big conferences are going to is having an impact on the financials of college football as well. But that's what we've got from the SEC. Moving on to the ACC, an article from Andrea Adelson, also from ESPN, talking about the ACC. They decided a couple of days ago that each team is going to do what they're calling a 10+1 schedule. Why they can't just call it an 11-game schedule, I don't know. But they have to be fancy and say it's 10+1, which is 11 if you can't do basic math. 10 of the games are going to be conference games against other ACC opponents, and the +1 game will be a non-conference game of the individual school's choosing. Now, the ACC made this system specifically to keep those in-state rivalry games that I just mentioned a moment ago. And then the day after they make this decision, or 2 days after they make this decision, the SEC comes along and says, no, we're just going to do an in-conference schedule only, so you don't get to play those games. Meanwhile, the ACC is going, but we made a game for you, SEC. What gives? What are you doing? And the SEC is like, nope, blah, 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 don't want to listen, conference only. So now the ACC has all these schools now, including the 4 ones that I mentioned a moment ago, that have to schedule a non-conference game, and those 4 schools can't schedule their SEC rival because SEC teams aren't playing anyone outside of their conference. Just another ridiculous thing that's happening because there is no centralized leadership from the NCAA that can standardize everything across the board. Anyways, the ACC season will begin on September 12th, 2 weeks before the SEC schedule begins. The ACC will not have divisions. Normally they have the Atlantic versus the Coastal Division. They are not having those divisions this season. But probably the biggest news is that Notre Dame, who traditionally is an independent and is not part of a conference, to give themselves more freedom in their scheduling, they have decided for this year only, they are going to jump into a conference, and that conference is the ACC. They had 6 games scheduled against ACC teams already this year, so they figured why not just go the full season as an ACC school for 1 year and 1 year only. And the ACC agreed, in part because they said adding on Notre Dame made the conference-only scheduling easier for a number of teams this season. So Notre Dame will be eligible to play in the ACC championship game, which will take place on either December 12th or December 19th, and it will be played by the 2 teams that have the highest conference winning percentage when the season's over. So out of those 10 conference games, whichever 2 teams have the best records, they will get into the ACC title game and they will play each other. Notre Dame is also eligible, if they win the ACC championship, to not only represent the ACC in the CFP if they're selected for it, but if not, they will be the ACC's automatic bid for the Orange Bowl. So this is a pretty big step on Notre Dame's part, especially because all revenue, including the revenue that Notre Dame makes from its televised games with NBC, will be shared across all 15 ACC schools. Normally, Notre Dame, as being an independent, doesn't have to share that TV revenue with anybody. Now they have taken the step of being willing to share that money, and now they're going to get some money from the ACC network, broadcasting all of Notre Dame's games because they're part of the ACC conference for this year. So that's a big step on Notre Dame's part. It's big for the conference, even though it's only going to last for a single year, hopefully, because of COVID-19. The non-conference game that each ACC team can schedule has to be played in an ACC state. So it's basically got to be a home game for the ACC team. And the visiting team has to meet health guidelines that the ACC has created. I'm not exactly sure what those guidelines are, but more than likely they deal with regular COVID-19 testing, regular antibody testing, temperature checks, and a few other things that the visiting team has to do. So if you're a team like Louisville, or if you're a team like Florida State, if you're Florida State, you could host Central Florida. You could host South Florida at your institution, as long as those schools meet the ACC health guidelines and check all the boxes. They can go to Tallahassee and they can play Florida State for their one non-conference game. That's how that's going to work. There are some games, though, besides the aforementioned ones that have been canceled. Florida State was supposed to play West Virginia out of the Big 12. That game's gone. Virginia was supposed to play Georgia from the SEC. That's obviously gone. North Carolina was supposed to play Auburn out of the SEC. That's obviously gone because the SEC ain't playing anybody outside of the SEC. So some other games now being canceled on the schedule. So that does it for the ACC. The ACC and the SEC literally just this week made these announcements on like Wednesday and Thursday respectively. They made these announcements. We've also got an article from Teddy Greenstein from the Chicago Tribune about the Big Ten. The Big Ten has not released any finalized plans yet. They're supposed to do that this coming week. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what the Big Ten is doing. What we do know is that the Big Ten was the first conference to announce that they are going to go to a conference-only schedule this season. The Pac-12 followed quickly on the heels of that, and then about 2 weeks later, we get news coming out of first the ACC, then the SEC, that they're following suit and doing conference-only schedules. The Big Ten schedule is likely going to start on September 5th, the time when week 1 of the college football season was supposed to start. Part of the reason that they're starting on time is that they're going to work in to a likely 10-game conference-only schedule, 3 to 5 off dates for teams to use in case they start getting positive tests for COVID-19 among players or coaching staff. So they'll schedule a few down weeks when teams can say take 2 Saturdays off to quarantine if there's an outbreak of COVID-19 among their players or among their coaches. And they'll need the full 13-week season to be able to fit those 3 to 5 off weeks in to a 10-game schedule. But more than likely, they're going to play a 10-game schedule. They could just do a 9-game schedule, but rumor has it that they're probably going to do a 10-game schedule. They're going to keep their divisions. They're going to keep the East versus the West. And from the Greenstein article, there were some ADs within the Big Ten that wanted to either backload or spread out the in-division games throughout the season. Well, they're not going to do that. Likely what they're going to do is they're going to front load the in-division games so that way there's less travel involved, and hopefully there's less risk of transmitting COVID-19. And then once a month or 2 of the season goes by, then they can start traveling a bit further afield within their own conference to play games. Once we know more about how COVID-19 is impacting college football, how it's impacting the schools in general, and how it's impacting other fall sports. The rest of the schedule, though, is completely up in the air. We don't have any final word from the Big Ten. As I said, they're supposed to give word probably next week about what the details of their schedule are going to be. There has been no talk about a bubble for coaches and players in the Big Ten like the NBA is doing with some pretty good success from what I understand. Nor has there been any talk of splitting the season, playing half of it in the spring, or moving the entire season to the spring. I've not heard any talk about that at all coming out of the Big Ten, so those options don't even seem to be on the table for the Big Ten Conference at the moment. They've also said that the actions of other conferences will not affect their decision-making. So whatever happens with the SEC or the ACC or the Pac-12 or the Big 12 or even some of the group of 5 schools like the American Athletic Conference, the Big Ten is going to do its own thing. So if there's an outbreak of COVID-19 among Pac-12 schools and they shut their season down, but everything's looking okay in the Midwest, the Big Ten apparently is going to go on and keep playing college football. Again, this is what happens when you have no centralized leadership. Speaking of testing positive, Two schools in the Big Ten, Rutgers and Michigan State, have already seen a couple of days after full practice has started, spikes in the number of positive COVID-19 tests. There were over a dozen student athletes, I should say, at MSU that tested positive a few days after practice has started. There were a few students at Rutgers that tested positive, and so they canceled a number of practices for a few days to try to quarantine their players and then go test them again to see if there are any additional positive cases, or if they've stemmed the tide for the moment of COVID-19. Maryland, however, they tested about 132 players the other day, and they had 0 positive tests. So that's a good thing. But the fact that two schools in the Big Ten, literally a couple of days after they started full practices, had a spike in COVID-19 positive tests does not bode well for the conference, and it does not bode well for college football. Not one bit. Lastly, we have the Pac-12, and we've got an article from Ben Kercheval and David Cobb from CBS Sports. They finalized their plans yesterday and released them to the public, so they're going to play a 10-game conference-only schedule. Again, everybody knew 2 weeks ago that they were going to do a conference-only schedule, but there was just a question of what the details were going to be, and they released those details yesterday. Every team is going to get 5 home games and 5 away games. The season's going to begin on September 26th. So again, the Big Ten so far is the only conference that is starting their season on time. But again, largely that's due to the fact that they want to work in a lot of weeks that teams can take off if they have positive tests increasing for COVID-19. The championship game is going to be held either on Friday, December 18th or Saturday, December 19th. Every team gets one bye week, and there is an off week between the end of the regular season and the conference championship game. That bye week is December 12th, and missed games because of COVID-19 can be made up during a bye week or during that conference-wide off week on December 12th. That would suck if you were a team that was set to be in the Pac-12 championship game and you had to make up a game on the 12th. Meanwhile, you were playing an opponent that has that as another bye week, so they get another week to rest up. That's going to be problematic, and you're going to hear some complaints about that if that comes to pass later on this season. I was looking at the article that I linked to in the information section below that has the full schedule for all of the Pac-12 teams. And I found it interesting that they moved some of the traditional rivalry games to earlier in the season. Normally, for example, the Apple Cup between Washington and Washington State is the last game of the season. This year, it's the second to last game of the season. The Civil War between Oregon and Oregon State is normally the last game of the season for those two teams. Now it's being played in week 4. The in-state rivalry between Arizona and Arizona State is most of the time the last game of the season. This year, it's the first game of the season. I don't really know why they moved those rivalry games unless it had to do with trying to move the schedule pieces around so that every team got 5 home games and 5 road games. That's the only thing I can think of. I found an article from an online website associated with the Arizona Wildcats program, and they had mentioned how that was proving troublesome, arranging the schedule so that everyone got 5 home games and 5 away games. So maybe that has to do with it, but just find it a bit odd that they decided to move some of those traditional rivalry games to earlier weeks. We're also seeing some big Pac-12, I almost said Pac-10, Pac-12 Big Ten matchups being canceled. Michigan was supposed to travel to Seattle to take on the Washington Huskies. That game has been canceled. Ohio State was supposed to travel to Eugene to play defending Rose Bowl champ Oregon. I was so looking forward to that game. That game got canceled. So just like with the other conferences, there are some big matchups that were supposed to be played in the first few weeks of the season that have been canceled due to COVID-19 and have been canceled due to the actions taken by the respective conferences. And again, I cannot stress this enough. This is what happens when you don't have any sort of centralized leadership making decisions that apply to everyone across the board. I mentioned that in my previous video. The NCAA is not taking a leadership role in this. They are stepping back and saying, nope, we're going to be totally hands off because we want the member schools and conferences to make their own decisions. So now you've got the Big Ten starting on September 5th, the Pac-12 and the SEC not starting until September 26th, and the ACC starting on, September 12th. So the start times for all the conferences are all out of sorts and not combined. So on September 5th, you're going to have a handful of Big Ten games and maybe some other games from Group of 5 schools or less notable conferences. But you won't see any SEC football for like 3 weeks after that. You won't see any Pac-12 football for 3 weeks after that. You won't see any ACC football until the following week. And it's just going to be really weird because there's going to be weeks in the Big Ten where you're going to have a bunch of schools that have the week off because they're quarantining or they're having a bye week. Conference championship games are getting moved to like literally right before Christmas. And now that's going to impact bowl season because normally by December 19th, 20th, you start gearing up for bowl season. Is there going to be a postseason in college football? Is it just going to be the CFP games, the semifinal and the national championship game? Or are they going to push bowl season back into the beginning of January and play bowl games throughout all of January? And how does that upset the recruiting schedule for coaches? How does that affect the recruiting schedule for high school kids that are starting to go to school? How does that affect those early practices and getting those students on campus for the winter semester? How does all of that get affected if you move that back? Maybe they won't play any bowl games, but then how does that affect college financials and the schools getting paid buku bucks for getting to a bowl game? There are so many questions that still have to be answered with what to do with college football and fall sports in general due to the influence of COVID-19. And I have not heard nary a word about any of that. And it's because I don't think anyone's thinking about that. I think they're just thinking, let's get this started. Let's at least get the football season started, and we will make those decisions when we need to. They're essentially taking a we'll cross those bridges when we come to them attitude. And right now, I don't think that's the best way to do it. They should have started planning for this back in May. They should not have waited this long to make these decisions. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not even 100% sure that there should be a college football season taking place this year. Because I don't think, as Michigan State and Rutgers have shown, that there is really any way to keep all the coaching staff, all the players safe over the course of a 13-week period, even if you're playing a reduced number of games. Because what really is the difference between traveling from Columbus, Ohio to Eugene, Oregon versus traveling from Columbus, Ohio to Ann Arbor, Michigan? You're still leaving your home area and you're going to another location. I'd mentioned in the last video that I did that there is risk that some players might not report having COVID-19 symptoms when they start experiencing them. So they could be experiencing COVID-19, be either asymptomatic or just beginning to experience symptoms, but they don't say anything. And they could pass COVID-19 on to someone on another team that they're playing, who can then pass it on through huddles and through sideline activities and practice to their teammates before they even get tested and get a positive test result. So any sort of traveling is going to come with a tremendous amount of risk of spreading this disease. I think the Big Ten is making a smart decision by working in more off weeks to account for possibly seeing spikes in COVID-19 positive tests, but I'm just not sure that this is the smartest move to even do college football this season. As much as I hate to say, because I love watching college football, everybody's got to be safe. There was an article that came out that some studies done in Europe have shown that people that are quote unquote recovering from COVID-19 have damage to their heart that is reminiscent of what happens when you have a heart attack. And that damage is in some cases permanent. So you're potentially putting the future health and well-being of lots of people at risk by continuing to think that the financials of college football are more important than the health and safety of your players and of your coaches and of everyone else who's associated with those programs, trainers and equipment managers and things like that. So that's essentially what the conferences are deciding on. The Big 12, nobody knows. I don't even think the Big 12 knows what they're doing. They haven't said anything yet. There's no plan of action. They haven't mentioned whether or not they're going to do an all-conference schedule. They haven't talked about what details they're going to do are. Nobody's heard anything from the Big 12, so we'll still have to wait maybe next week after the Big 10 finalizes their plans. Maybe we'll finally get word from the last of the Power 5 conferences. I don't know. We'll have to see what happens with that. Well, thank you everybody for watching. Make sure you subscribe to this channel, like this video, share this video and the channel with people who you think might enjoy my college football vids or my history vids that I have. Please check those out. There's a number of those that you can watch to learn a few things about the history of Europe. And I will see all of you next time.